The knock came before the birds, 3 slow raps, then a pause, as if whoever stood on the other side was listening for my breath. I lay there, eyes open in the blue dark, the quilt heavy on my chest. The house was still, but the air felt different, like the world was waiting for something to happen. I sat up, feet finding the cold floorboards. The clock on the dresser said 5:12. Too early for neighbors, too late for dreams. I listened, holding my breath, but the only sound was the wind pressing against the old glass. Then, again, 3 knocks, softer this time, but insistent. I pulled on my sweater, the one with the frayed cuffs, and padded down the hallway, each step creaking like a question. The front door was painted green, chipped at the edges. I pressed my palm to the wood, feeling the chill seep through. For a moment, I thought about not opening it. But something in the silence, something in the way the morning held its breath, made me turn the lock. He stood there, framed by the pale light, a man, maybe 40, maybe older, with a face that looked like it had forgotten how to rest. His hands were wrapped in rags, stained dark at the fingertips. He didn't shiver, but I could see the cold in the way his shoulders hunched, the way his breath clouded in the air between us. He didn't say hello, didn't ask for help or offer a name. He just looked past me, over my shoulder, toward the barn at the edge of the field. His eyes were the color of river stones, gray, unreadable, tired. I cleared my throat, voice small in the morning hush. "Can I help you?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze stayed fixed on the barn, as if he was waiting for it to move, or speak, or open its doors on its own. Finally, he spoke. His voice was rough, like gravel under boots. "The barn. Is it still yours?" I nodded, unsure. "It's been in my family a long time." He swallowed, jaw working. "Long enough," he said, almost to himself. I stepped back, the door open, just wide enough for him to see the warmth inside. "Do you want to come in? It's cold." He shook his head, quick and sharp. "No, I can't." He looked down at his hands, flexing them beneath the rags. "I just need to know, has anyone been in the loft?" I hesitated. The loft. I hadn't been up there in years, not since before my mother died. I remembered dust and the smell of old hay and the way the light slanted through the boards in the late afternoon. "No," I said, "not for a long time." He nodded, almost relieved, but his eyes never left the barn. I watched him, trying to place his face, his voice, the way he stood like he was bracing for a blow. He looked like someone who'd been running for a long time and finally stopped. I wrapped my arms around myself, feeling the cold settle in. "Would you like some coffee?" He hesitated, then nodded once. "On the porch," he said. "Please." I left the door open behind me, the house breathing out warmth as I moved through the kitchen. The kettle was already on the stove, a habit from my mother, always ready for someone who might come by. I watched the water begin to tremble, steam curling up like a question. Outside, the sky was turning from blue to gray, the first light catching on the frost that rimmed the windows. I poured 2 mugs, hands steady, and carried them out to the porch. He was sitting on the top steps, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the barn. I handed him a mug, careful not to touch his bandaged hands. He took it, nodding his thanks, and held it close to his chest. We sat in silence, the only sound the wind moving through the dry grass. I sipped my coffee, watching the steam rise and disappear. He didn't drink, just held the mug, letting the heat seep through the rags. After a while, I spoke. "Did you used to live here?" He shook his head. "No, but my family, they were here, once." He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw something flicker in his eyes, fear or hope, or maybe both. He set the mug down, hands trembling. "There's something in that barn," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "That belonged to us. Something we left behind." He looked away, jaw tight. "I need to know if it's still there." I felt a chill run through me, colder than the morning air. "What is it?" He shook his head, lips pressed thin. "A secret," he said. "A promise. My family's, and maybe yours too." The sun was rising now, the light catching on the barn's old tin roof, turning it silver. I watched the way he stared at it, as if he could see through the walls, through time itself. I wanted to ask more, but the words felt heavy in my mouth. He stood, slow and careful, as if every movement hurt. He looked at me, eyes softening for just a moment. "Thank you for the coffee," he said. He started down the steps, boots crunching on the gravel. I watched him go, the barn looming behind him, silent and still. He paused at the edge of the yard and turned back and said, almost too quiet to hear, "It hid my family's secret. Don't forget that." Then he was gone, swallowed by the morning mist, leaving only the echo of his words and the faint smell of smoke in the air. I sat there, coffee cooling in my hands, watching the barn as the sun climbed higher. The world felt different, tilted, uncertain, as if something had shifted beneath my feet. I wondered what secrets the barn held and why they had waited so long to find me. The wind picked up, rattling the porch rail, and I pulled my sweater tighter around my shoulders. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called, sharp and lonely. I listened to the silence and waited for the day to begin. The morning after he left, the house felt emptier than usual. I woke to a pale, washed-out light, the kind that makes everything look softer, older. The coffee pot was still half full from the day before, and the mug he'd used sat on the porch rail, a faint ring of warmth left behind. I stood in the kitchen, hands wrapped around my own cup, watching the steam rise and curl in the quiet. Outside, the fields were silver with dew, and the barn stood at the edge of it all, its roof catching the first thin rays of sun. I could see the path his boots had made in the gravel, leading away from the house, fading into the grass. I tried to settle into my morning, but the house wouldn't let me. Every floorboard seemed to creak a little louder, every shadow stretched a little longer. I found myself glancing at the window, half expecting to see him standing there again, hands wrapped in rags, eyes fixed on the barn. The memory of his voice lingered in the corners of the room. "It hid my family's secret. Don't forget that." I wondered what kind of secret could survive so many years, tucked away in a place meant for hay and tools and the quiet work of living. I thought about my grandfather, about the stories he used to tell, stories of fires and debts, of things lost and never spoken of again. I remembered the way he'd look at the barn sometimes, as if it was holding something he couldn't quite name. The wind picked up, rattling the old glass in the kitchen window. I stepped outside, the cold biting at my cheeks, and walked toward the barn. The grass was wet, soaking through my socks, but I didn't turn back. The barn looked the same as it always had. Weathered boards, rusted hinges, the faint smell of old straw and earth. But as I got closer, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, blackened streaks along the bottom of the door, as if someone had tried to scrub away the memory of fire. I knelt down, running my fingers over the marks. The wood was rough, splintered, and when I pressed my palm flat against it, I felt a strange warmth, as if the sun had been shining there all night. I stood, brushing the dirt from my knees, and pulled open the door. The hinges groaned, echoing in the stillness. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the faint, lingering scent of smoke. Light filtered through the cracks in the walls, painting stripes across the floor. I stepped inside, letting the door fall shut behind me. The barn was quiet, but not empty. Every corner seemed to hold a memory. Old tools hanging from nails, a broken ladder propped against the wall, bales of hay stacked in the shadows. I walked slowly, my footsteps muffled by the dirt and straw. I found myself drawn to the far end, where the loft ladder climbed up into the darkness. I hesitated at the bottom, looking up. The loft had always felt like another world, higher, dustier, filled with things that didn't belong anywhere else. I remembered my mother's voice, soft but firm. "Don't go up there unless you have to." I never asked why. I reached out, touching the rung of the ladder. It was cold, smooth from years of hands, and I wondered how many secrets it had carried up and down. I didn't climb, not yet. Instead, I walked the perimeter, letting my fingers trail along the walls. In the far corner, I found a pile of old boards, charred at the edges, stacked neatly as if someone had tried to hide them. I knelt, picking up a piece. The black soot rubbed off on my skin, leaving a mark that wouldn't wash away. The wind outside picked up, whistling through the cracks. I stood, heart beating a little faster, and looked around. The barn felt different now, heavier, as if it was holding its breath. I thought about the stranger, about the way he'd looked at this place, the way his voice had trembled when he spoke of secrets and promises. I wondered what he was hoping to find, or maybe what he was hoping to forget. I stepped back into the light, blinking against the sudden brightness. The air outside was sharp, filled with the scent of wet grass and something else, something burned, carried on the wind from a memory I couldn't quite reach. I walked back to the house, wiping my hands on my jeans, the black smudge still clinging to my skin. I stood on the porch, looking out at the barn, and tried to remember if I'd ever seen it burn. I couldn't, but the marks were there, plain as day, and the smell of smoke seemed to follow me, no matter how many times I washed my hands. I thought about my grandfather again, about the way he'd sit on this same porch, staring out at the fields, as if he was waiting for something to come home. I wondered what he'd say if he saw me now chasing ghosts through the morning light. The day moved on, slow and gray. I tried to busy myself with chores, but my mind kept drifting back to the barn, to the stranger, to the secrets that seemed to hang in the air like dust. I found myself standing at the window, watching the wind move through the grass, listening for footsteps that never came. The house felt too quiet, the silence pressing in around me. I thought about lighting a fire, about filling the rooms with warmth and light, but something held me back. The memory of smoke was too close, too real. As the sun began to set, the sky turned a deep, bruised blue. I stood on the porch, arms wrapped around myself, and watched the barn fade into shadow. The wind had died down, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of a crow. I closed my eyes, breathing in the cool air, and tried to let go of the questions that circled in my mind. But the smell of smoke lingered, and the memory of the stranger's voice echoed in the quiet. It hid my family's secret. Don't forget that. I wondered what kind of secret might survive so many years, tucked away in a place meant for hay and tools and the quiet work of living. Night settled over the fields, soft and heavy. I stood there for a while longer, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of the barn's shadow stretch across the yard. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked sharp and lonely. I turned back toward the house, the porch light flickering on behind me, and let the door close softly at my back. The barn stood silent in the darkness, holding its secrets close. I wondered if by morning the wind would carry them to me, or if they would stay hidden, just out of reach, like ashes in the wind. The next morning, the sky was a dull, unremarkable gray, the kind that makes you feel like the day never really started. I moved through the house quietly, careful not to disturb the hush that had settled over everything. The coffee tasted flat, and the radio stayed off. I found myself glancing at the barn through the kitchen window, the way you look at something you're not sure you want to remember. The blackened marks on the door were still there, darker now in the wet light. I couldn't stop thinking about the stranger's words, about secrets and promises, about the way his eyes had never left the barn. By mid-morning, I gave in to the pull. I put on my boots and an old jacket, the one with the missing button, and stepped out into the yard. The grass was slick with dew and the air smelled faintly of earth and old smoke. I walked slowly, each step measured, as if the ground itself might give way. The barn loomed ahead, silent and watchful. I paused at the door, hand resting on the rough wood, and listened. Nothing but the wind and the distant sound of a truck on the highway. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The barn was colder than I remembered. Light filtered through the cracks in the walls, striping the floor with pale gold. Dust hung in the air, swirling in the beams of sunlight. I stood for a moment, letting my eyes adjust, then walked toward the ladder that led up to the loft. The ladder was old, the wood worn smooth by years of hands and feet. I ran my fingers along the rungs, feeling the grooves and splinters. My mother's voice echoed in my mind. "Don't go up there unless you have to." I wondered what she'd been trying to protect me from. I climbed slowly, the ladder creaking beneath my weight. At the top, I found the loft door, small, heavy, and locked tight with a rusted padlock. I knelt in front of it, running my hand over the wood. The grain was raised, rough beneath my palm, and I could see where someone had scratched at it years ago. I tried the handle, but it didn't budge. The lock was old, the kind you don't see much anymore, and I realized I had no idea where the key might be. I sat back on my heels, listening to the quiet. The air up here was different, thicker somehow, as if it was holding its breath. I looked around the loft, searching for anything that might help. There were boxes stacked against the far wall, covered in a thick layer of dust. I opened one, coughing as the dust rose up around me. Inside were old tools, a coil of rope, a broken lantern, nothing that looked like a key. I moved to the next box, then the next, sifting through the detritus of years. I found a faded photograph, the edges curled and brittle. It showed the barn, years ago, with people standing in front of it, faces I didn't recognize, blurred by time and smoke. I slipped the photo into my pocket, feeling the weight of it settle there. I stood, brushing dust from my jeans, and walked back to the locked door. I pressed my ear against it, listening. Nothing, just the sound of my own breath and the faint creak of the barn settling around me. I wondered what was on the other side, what my family had hidden away, what the stranger was searching for. I thought about the stories my grandfather used to tell, about deaths and fires and things best left alone. I wondered if this was one of those things. I climbed back down the ladder, my legs shaky. The barn felt colder now, the shadows longer. I walked the perimeter again, looking for anything I might have missed. In the far corner, I found a small metal box, half buried beneath a pile of old feed sacks. I pulled it out, hand shaking, and pried it open. Inside were a handful of keys, each one different, some old, some new, all heavy with the weight of years. I took them all, closing the box and tucking it under my arm. Back in the loft, I tried each key, one by one. Most didn't fit. One turned, but the lock wouldn't open. The last key was small, almost delicate, with a bit of ribbon tied to it. I slid it into the lock, heart pounding, and turned. The lock clicked open, the sound loud in the quiet. I hesitated, hand on the latch, then pushed the door open a crack. The air that spilled out was cold and stale, tinged with the faintest trace of smoke. I didn't open the door all the way, not yet. I stood there, breathing in the old air, feeling the weight of the years pressing in around me. I thought about the stranger, about the way he looked at the barn, about the secret he said was hidden here. I wondered if I was ready to find out what it was. I closed the door gently, slipping the key into my pocket, and climbed back down the ladder. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the loose boards on the barn's roof. I stood in the yard, looking up at the loft window, the glass clouded with dust. I felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity, a sense that something was waiting for me, just out of sight. I wondered what I would find when I finally opened that door, and whether it would change anything at all. The day faded into evening, the sky streaked with pink and gold. I sat on the porch, the photograph in my hand, tracing the faces with my thumb. The barn stood silent in the gathering dark, the secret in the loft waiting, patient as ever. I listened to the wind, to the quiet, to the questions that circled in my mind. I knew I couldn't leave the door closed forever, but for now I let the secret rest, locked away in the loft, while the world turned quietly around it.
The next day, the rain came. Not a hard rain, but a steady, whispering drizzle that blurred the edges of everything. I watched it from the kitchen window, the drops tracing slow paths down the glass, turning the barn into a gray shape in the distance. The world felt smaller, quieter, as if the rain was washing away the noise and leaving only the things that mattered. I made coffee and sat at the table, the photograph from the loft lying in front of me. The faces were still blurred, the edges curled and brittle, but I couldn't stop looking at it. I traced the outline of the barn with my finger, wondering who those people were and what they had left behind. By mid-morning, the rain had eased to a mist. I pulled on my boots and jacket, the ones still damp from yesterday, and walked out to the barn. The grass was slick and cold, and the air smelled of wet earth and old wood. Inside, the barn was dim, the light from the open door barely reaching the far corners. I climbed the ladder to the loft, the photograph tucked in my pocket, and opened the door with the blue ribboned key. The air inside was thick with dust, and the faint, lingering scent of smoke. I stepped carefully, my footsteps muffled by the old boards. The loft was smaller than I remembered. Boxes lined the walls, some collapsed under their own weight, others still holding their shape. I knelt beside one, the lid half open, and began to sift through its contents. Old letters, yellowed and brittle, tied with string. A child's shoe, the leather cracked and stiff. A tin box filled with buttons and bits of ribbon. At the bottom, wrapped in a piece of scorched cloth, I found another photograph. This one was burned along one edge, the faces half lost to the fire. I held it up to the light, trying to make out the details. There was the barn, unmistakable, and in front of it, a family. 2 adults, 3 children, all standing close together. Their faces were turned toward the camera, but the fire had blurred their features, leaving only shadows and the suggestion of eyes. I sat back on my heels, the photograph trembling in my hands. I thought of the stranger, of the way his eyes had searched the barn, the way his voice had caught when he spoke of secrets. I wondered if these were his people, if this was the family he lost. I tried to imagine what it would be like to have your history burned away, to be left with only fragments and questions. I felt a heaviness settle in my chest, a kind of grief for something I'd never known. I took the photograph back to the house, wiping the dust from my hands. I set it on the kitchen table beside the first one, studying them side by side. The barn was the same in both, but the people were different. Different clothes, different postures, different years. I wondered how many families had passed through this place, how many stories had been left behind in the walls and the dust. I thought about my own family, about the things we never talked about, the silences that stretched between us like fences. The rain picked back up again, tapping softly on the roof. I made another cup of coffee and sat at the table, the photograph spread out before me. I tried to piece together the story, to find the thread that connected the stranger to this place, to me. I remembered the way he'd looked at the barn, the way he refused to come inside, as if the house itself was a boundary he couldn't cross. I wondered what had happened here, what had driven his family to hide, what had forced them to leave. As the afternoon faded, I heard footsteps on the porch. I looked up, heart pounding, half expecting to see the stranger standing there, rain dripping from his coat. But the porch was empty, the only sound the wind rattling the screen door. I stood, the photographs in my hand, and walked to the window. The barn stood silent in the rain, its secret safe for another day. I spent the rest of the evening moving through the house, the photographs never far from reach. I found myself listening for sounds that weren't there, a voice calling from the yard, the creak of footsteps in the loft, the crackle of fire in the distance. I thought about the promises we make, the ones we keep, and the ones we break. I wondered what promise had been made here, and what it had cost. As night fell, I sat on the porch, the photographs in my lap, and watched the rain turn the world to silver. The barn was just a shadow now, barely visible through the mist. I thought about the stranger, about the way he'd looked at the barn, the way he refused to come inside, as if the house itself was a boundary he couldn't cross. I wondered what had happened here, what had driven his family to hide, what had forced them to leave. The rain slowed, the drops falling farther apart, the world settling into a deeper quiet. I closed my eyes, listening to the hush, feeling the weight of the photographs in my hands. I thought about the faces in the pictures, about the lives they'd lived, the things they'd lost. I wondered if, in the end, we are all just trying to hold on to something, some memory, some promise, some piece of ourselves that refuses to burn away. The night deepened, the air cool and damp. I stood, slipping the photographs into a drawer, and turned off the porch light. The barn stood silent in the darkness, its secret safe for now. I listened to the rain, to the quiet, to the questions that lingered in the air. I wondered what I would find if I kept searching, and whether I was ready for the answers. The house settled around me, the silence deep and soft, and I let myself rest, the memory of the burned photograph flickering in the dark.
That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but the world outside my window was restless, branches tapping against the glass, the wind shifting in the eaves. I lay in bed, the burned photographs on the nightstand, their edges curling in the lamplight. I kept thinking about the faces, the way the fire had blurred them, the way the barn looked behind them, solid, unchanged, as if it had watched everything and remembered it all. I closed my eyes, but the images wouldn't leave me. Instead, I drifted into a half-dream, the kind that feels more real than waking. In the dream, the barn was on fire. Not the wild, roaring kind of fire, but a slow, steady glow, as if the wood itself was lit from within. The sky was orange and thick with smoke, and I could hear voices, soft, urgent, calling out names I didn't know. I saw shadows moving behind the barn doors, hands pressed to the glass of the loft window, eyes wide and shining in the flickering light. I tried to move, to call out, but my voice was lost in the crackle and hiss of burning wood. The barn glowed brighter, the light spilling out across the fields, turning the grass to gold. I woke with a start, heart pounding, the smell of smoke sharp in my nose. For a moment, I thought the dream had followed me into waking. The room was dark, but the air felt thick, heavy with the memory of fire. I sat up, listening. The house was silent, but something felt wrong, off, as if the world had shifted while I slept. I got up, pulling on my sweater, and moved through the house in the dark. The floor was cold under my feet, the boards creaking with every step. I paused at the back door, hand on the knob, and looked out across the yard. The barn was just a shadow in the moonlight, but something caught my eye, a faint, flickering glow at the edge of the door, like the last ember of a dying fire. I stepped outside, the grass wet and cold against my ankles. The air was sharp, filled with the scent of rain and something else, something burned, lingering at the edge of memory. I followed the path to the barn, heart thudding in my chest, every step slower than the last. As I got closer, I saw muddy footprints in the grass, leading from the road to the barn door. They were fresh, pressed deep into the earth, the edges still sharp. I knelt, touching one with my fingers. The mud was cold, but the print was warm, as if someone had just passed through. I stood, wiping my hand on my jeans, and reached for the barn door. The glow was brighter now, spilling out through the cracks, painting the ground with shifting light. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in the quiet. Inside, the barn was filled with shadows, the air thick with the smell of old smoke and damp wood. The glow came from the loft, a soft, golden light that pulsed like a heartbeat. I climbed the ladder, each rung cold and slick beneath my hands. At the top, the loft door was ajar, the blue-ribboned key still in the lock. I hesitated, listening. The only sound was my own breath, quick and shallow in the dark. I pushed the door open, the light spilling out around me. The loft was empty, but the air was warm, almost hot, as if the fire from my dream had left its mark here. The boxes and old trunks cast long shadows on the walls, and in the center of the floor, the burned photographs lay scattered, their edges glowing in the strange light. I knelt, picking one up. The faces were clearer now, the fire's damage softened by the glow. I traced the outline of a child's face, the curve of a woman's hand resting on his shoulder. I felt a wave of sadness, sharp and sudden, as if I was mourning something I'd never known. I heard a sound behind me, a soft, shuffling step on the ladder. I turned, heart in my throat, but the loft was empty. The light flickered, then faded, leaving only the pale moonlight streaming through the cracks in the roof. I sat there for a long time, the photographs in my lap, listening to the barn settle around me. The air cooled, the warmth fading, but the memory of the glow lingered, a gentle ache in my chest. When I finally climbed down, the barn was dark and silent. The muddy footprints were still there, leading back toward the road, but the glow was gone. I stood in the doorway, looking out across the fields, the sky just beginning to pale with the first hint of dawn. The world felt changed, as if the night had burned away something old, leaving only the truth behind. I walked back to the house, the photographs pressed close to my heart. I thought about the stranger, about the way he'd looked at the barn, the way his hands had trembled when he spoke of secrets. I wondered if he'd come back in the night, searching for something he'd lost, or if the barn itself had called up the memory of fire, asking to be seen, to be remembered. Inside, the house was quiet, the only sound the soft tick of the clock in the hallway. I sat at the kitchen table, the photographs spread out before me, and watched the light grow in the east. I felt tired, but lighter, as if the night had lifted some of the weight I'd been carrying. The barn stood silent in the morning light, its secrets safe for now, but I knew the story wasn't finished. I wondered what I would find if I kept searching, and whether I was ready for the answers. The day began, slow and quiet, and I let myself rest, the memory of the night's glow flickering at the edge of my mind. The morning after the barn glowed, the world felt washed clean. The air was sharp, almost sweet, and the grass sparkled with dew. I moved through the house quietly, as if not to disturb whatever had shifted in the night. The photographs from the loft sat on the kitchen table, their burned edges curling in the sunlight. I traced the faces with my thumb, feeling the weight of their silence. The barn stood at the edge of the field, unchanged, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me. I finished my coffee and pulled on my boots, the laces stiff with old mud. The sky was a pale, cloudless blue, the kind that makes you feel like anything could happen. I walked out to the barn, the boards creaking under my hand as I opened the door. Inside, the air was cool and still, the dust swirling in the shafts of light. I climbed the ladder to the loft, the blue-ribboned key heavy in my pocket. The door opened easily now, the lock hanging loose. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. I moved slowly, searching the shadows for something I couldn't name. The boxes and trunks were just as I'd left them, but the air felt different, charged, expectant. I knelt beside an old trunk, the leather cracked and faded, and lifted the lid. Inside were blankets, moth-eaten and soft, and beneath them a stack of ledgers bound in brittle leather. I pulled one out, the cover flaking in my hands, and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was careful, looping, familiar. My grandfather's. Dates and names filled the columns, each line a record of something traded, something owed. I turned the pages slowly, the paper soft and yellowed. Some entries were simple. Bushels of corn, a borrowed plow, a calf born in the spring. Others were stranger. 3 nights' shelter, family of 5. Owed silence, paid in full. The words felt heavy, as if they carried more than their meaning. I found another hand, smaller, sharper, squeezed into the margins. Don't forget. Promise kept. The entries stopped abruptly. The last date circled in red. The night of the fire. I sat back, the ledger open in my lap, and listened to the barn settle around me. The silence was thick, filled with the weight of things unsaid. I thought about the stranger, about the way he'd looked at the barn, the way his voice had trembled when he spoke of secrets. I wondered if his family's name was written here, hidden among the debts and promises. I ran my finger down the list, searching for something that would make sense of it all. Near the end, I found it. A name I didn't recognize, written in my grandfather's hand, and beside it a single word, safe. The ink was smudged, as if someone had tried to wipe it away. I closed the ledger, the sound loud in the quiet, and set it aside. I pulled out the other books, flipping through them quickly. Each one told a story of hard years and lean harvests, of neighbors helping neighbors, of debts paid and unpaid, but always there were secrets tucked between the lines. Keep the door locked. Don't let them see. Remember the promise. I sat in the loft for a long time, the ledgers spread out around me, the dust settling on my shoulders. I thought about my grandfather, about the things he'd carried, the things he'd chosen to hide. I wondered what it cost him to keep those secrets safe. I wondered what it had cost the families who'd passed through here, leaving only their names and promise behind. The barn felt smaller now, the walls closing in, the air thick with memory. I stood gathering the ledgers in my arms and climbed down the ladder. The barn was quiet, the only sound the soft scuff of my boots on the floor. I carried the books back to the house, setting them on the kitchen table beside the photographs. I sat, tracing the names with my finger, trying to piece together the story. I thought about the stranger, about the way he'd asked about the loft, about the fear in his eyes when he spoke of secrets. I wondered if his family's name was written here, hidden among the debts and promises. The afternoon passed in a hush, the house filled with the soft sound of pages turning. I read until the light faded, the words blurring on the page. I felt the weight of the secrets pressing in, the burden of promises made and kept and broken. I wondered if I was ready to carry them, or if I would end up like my grandfather, haunted by the things I couldn't say. As evening fell, I stood on the porch, the ledger stacked neatly on the table behind me. The barn was a dark shape against the sky, its secrets safe for another night. I listened to the wind moving through the grass, the hush of the world settling in. I thought about the stranger, about the family who'd hidden here, about the promise that had tied us all together. I wondered what I would do with the truth, now that I'd found it. The stars came out one by one, the sky deep and endless. I stood in the quiet, the weight of the ledgers in my hands, and let the night settle around me. The barn stood silent, the secrets inside, waiting, patient as ever. I wondered if I was ready to face them, or if I would keep them hidden, locked away in the dark. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of earth and memory, and I listened, hoping for an answer. The next morning, the world was hushed, as if the fields and sky were holding their breath. I woke early, the ledgers still stacked on the kitchen table, their spines cracked and pages splayed open like wounds. I made coffee, the sound of the kettle the only thing breaking the quiet. I kept glancing at the barn through the window, the way you look at something you know you'll have to face again. But it wasn't the barn that pulled at me now, it was the names in the ledger, the stories half told, the debts and promises that seemed to echo in every corner of the house. I thought about the stranger, about the way he'd spoken of secrets and family, about the fear in his eyes. I wondered if anyone else remembered what happened here, or if the silence had swallowed it all. I found myself thinking of Mrs. Ellison, our neighbor down the road. She'd lived here longer than anyone, her memory sharp as a tack even as her hands had grown unsteady. If anyone knew the truth, it would be her. I wrapped the ledger in a dish towel, tucked it under my arm, and set out down the gravel road, the morning air cool and damp against my skin. Her house was small, white paint peeling, the porch sagging under the weight of years. I knocked gently, the sound muffled by the thick air. After a moment, the door creaked open and Mrs. Ellison peered out, her eyes bright behind thick glasses. "Mara?" she said, her voice soft with surprise. "It's early. Everything all right?" I nodded, holding up the ledger. "I was hoping you could help me with something." She stepped aside, waving me in, and I followed her into the kitchen, the air heavy with the scent of tea and old wood. We sat at her table, the ledger between us. I opened it to the page with the unfamiliar name, the word safe, circled in red. Mrs. Ellison traced the letters with a trembling finger, her brow furrowed. For a long time she didn't speak. The clock on the wall ticked, slow and steady. Finally, she looked up, her eyes shining with something like fear. "I remember that night," she said quietly. "The night the barn burned." Her voice was thin but steady. "There was a family, came through in the dark, looking for shelter. Your grandfather let them stay in the loft. Folks were scared back then, scared of strangers, scared of what might follow them." She paused, her hands folded tight in her lap. "There was talk after the fire. Some said it was an accident. Others said it was meant to be, to drive them out, or worse." She shook her head, her voice trembling. "Your grandfather changed after that. He stopped talking about the war, about the old days. He kept to himself, spent more time in the barn. I always wondered what he was carrying." I listened, the weight of her words settling over me like a blanket. I thought about the entries in the ledger, about the promises made and broken, about the silence that had grown up around them. Mrs. Ellison reached across the table, her hand warm and dry on mine. "Some things, Mara, they're too heavy to carry alone. But silence, it can be heavier still." She squeezed my hand, her eyes searching mine. "You have a good heart. Don't let the past turn it hard." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I wanted to ask her more, to press for details, but I could see the exhaustion in her face, the way her shoulders sagged under the weight of memory. I thanked her, tucking the ledger back under my arm, and set out into the morning. The sky was brighter now, the clouds thinning to let in the sun. I walked slowly home, the gravel crunching under my boots, the air filled with the scent of wildflowers and earth. I thought about what Mrs. Ellison had said, about the fear that had gripped the town, about the way silence can grow until it fills every room. I wondered what my grandfather had felt, what he'd tried to protect, and what he'd lost in the process. Back at the house, I set the ledger on the table and stood at the window, looking out at the barn. The fields stretched out, green and gold, the wind moving through the grass in slow waves. I felt the weight of the silence pressing in, the burden of secrets kept too long. I wondered if I was strong enough to break it, or if I would end up like my grandfather, haunted by the things I couldn't say. The day passed quietly, the house filled with the soft sounds of living, water running, floorboards creaking, the distant call of a bird. I moved through the rooms, touching the walls, the photographs, the old quilts folded at the foot of the bed. I thought about the stranger, about the family who had hidden in the barn, about the promise that had tied us all together. I wondered if forgiveness was possible, or if the past was too heavy to lift. As evening fell, I sat on the porch, the ledger in my lap, and watched the sun sink behind the barn. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, the air cool and still. I listened to the quiet, to the questions that lingered in the air, to the weight of silence that pressed in around me. I wondered what I would do with the truth, now that I knew it. The barn stood dark against the sky, its secrets safe for another night. I closed my eyes, breathing in the hush, and let the silence settle, heavy and familiar, as the world slipped into dusk. The next day, the air was heavy with the promise of rain. I moved through the house in slow circles, the ledger and photographs spread across the kitchen table, the silence pressing in on all sides. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see the stranger's shape at the edge of the yard, but the only movement was the wind in the grass and the restless crows circling above the barn. I tried to busy myself with chores, washing dishes, folding laundry, sweeping the porch, but my mind kept drifting back to the stories Mrs. Ellison had told, to the names in the ledger, to the secrets that seemed to cling to the walls of this old house. It was late afternoon when I heard footsteps on the gravel. Not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, as if the person walking had finally decided there was nothing left to lose. I stepped onto the porch, heart thudding, and there he was, the stranger, his hands still wrapped in those stained bandages, his coat darker with the threat of rain. He paused at the bottom step, eyes searching mine, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of earth and something older, something like sorrow. He didn't ask to come inside. He just sat on the top step, shoulders hunched, hands folded in his lap. I sat beside him, leaving a careful space between us. The barn loomed in the distance, its shadow stretching long across the field. For a while, we just listened to the wind, the hush between us thick with things unsaid. Finally he spoke, his voice low and rough. I used to think if I came back here, I'd find answers, or maybe forgiveness, but all I feel is the weight of it. He looked down at his hands, flexing them beneath the rags. My family, we were running. There was trouble in town, and your grandfather let us hide in the loft. He didn't have to. He could have turned us away, but he didn't. He paused, the words catching in his throat. We stayed 3 nights, my mother, my father, my little brother and sister. I remember the way the hay smelled, the way the light came through the cracks in the boards. I remember being afraid, but also safe, for a little while. He looked up at the barn, his eyes distant. But then someone found out. I don't know who. There was shouting, and then the fire. My father tried to get us out, but the flames were everywhere. Your grandfather came running. He pulled me out first. I remember his hands, strong, rough, but gentle. He went back for the others, but the flames were too much. My mother and sister, they didn't make it. The wind rattled the porch rail, and I felt the ache of his words settle in my chest. He was quiet for a long time, staring at the barn as if he could see the past flickering in the shadows. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough. I used to think if I came back here, I'd find answers, or maybe forgiveness, but all I feel is the weight of it. He looked down at his hands, flexing them beneath the rags. My family, we were running. There was trouble in town, and your grandfather let us hide in the loft. He didn't have to. He could have turned us away, but he didn't. He paused, the words catching in his throat. We stayed 3 nights, my mother, my father, my little brother and sister. I remember the way the hay smelled, the way the light came through the cracks in the boards. I remember being afraid, but also safe. For a little while. He looked up at the barn, his eyes distant, but then someone found out. I don't know who. There was shouting, and then the fire. My father tried to get us out, but the flames were everywhere. Your grandfather came running. He pulled me out first. I remember his hands strong, rough, but gentle. He went back for the others, but the flames were too much. My mother and sister, they didn't make it. The wind rattled the porch rail, and I felt the ache of his words settle in my chest. He was quiet for a long time, staring at the barn as if he could see the past flickering in the shadows. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough. I used to think if I came back here, I'd find answers, or maybe forgiveness. But all I feel is the weight of it. He looked down at his hands, flexing them beneath the rags. My family, we were running. There was trouble in town, and your grandfather let us hide in the loft. He didn't have to. He could have turned us away, but he didn't. He had a choice, and he chose to help us. He laid them safe in the loft. He looked at me, his eyes tired and raw, and I saw all the pain and sorrow and guilt he had carried for so many years. I came back because I needed to know if it meant anything. If the promise your grandfather made to keep us safe was worth anything at all. I wanted to reach out to offer comfort, but the space between us felt too wide. Instead, I told him what I'd found, the ledger, the names, the word safe, written in my grandfather's hand. I told him about Mrs. Ellison, about the stories and the silence, about the way the past had settled over this place like dust. He listened, his face unreadable, but I saw something shift in his eyes, a softening maybe, or just the relief of being seen. He took a deep breath, the air trembling in his chest. I don't know what I expected. Maybe I thought if I came back here, I'd find answers, or maybe forgiveness, but all I feel is the weight of it. He looked down at his hands, flexing them beneath the rags. Your grandfather, he tried. He did what he could. That's more than most. He looked at the barn one last time, his gaze steady. You need to take care of the barn. It remembers more than we do. The first drops of rain began to fall, soft and cold on the porch steps. He stood, slow and careful, and looked down at his hands. I should go, he said quietly. But thank you, for listening, for not turning away. I nodded, unable to find the right words. He started down the steps, his boots leaving dark prints on the wet wood. At the edge of the yard he paused, turning back to me. Take care of the barn, he said. It remembers more than we do. I watched him go, the rain blurring his shape until he was just a shadow moving through the field. The barn stood silent, the weight of his story settling over it like a shroud. I sat on the porch, the rain soaking through my sleeves, and let the silence fill the space he'd left behind. I thought about the promise, about the cost of keeping it, about the way stories can bind us together after everything else has burned away. As the rain fell harder, I gathered the ledger and photographs, carrying them inside. I set them on the table, the pages damp with the memory of his words. I stood at the window, watching the barn through the rain, and wondered if forgiveness was possible, not just for him, but for all of us. The house was quiet, the only sound the steady drum of rain on the roof. I let myself breathe, the weight of the story settling in my bones, and waited for the storm to pass. The rain didn't let up for 2 days. It fell in steady sheets, turning the yard to mud and the fields to a blur of green and brown. I spent most of that time inside, listening to the soft drum of water on the roof, the hush of wind against the windows. The house felt smaller, the walls closer, as if the weather was pressing everything inward. I moved from room to room, restless, the stranger's story echoing in my mind. Sometimes I'd catch myself standing at the window, watching the barn through the rain, wondering if the past could ever really be washed away. On the third morning, the rain slowed to a mist. The world outside was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and something older, something like memory. I pulled on my boots and jacket, the ground sucking at my feet as I crossed the yard. The barn looked different in the gray light, its boards dark with rain, the roof shining with a thin sheen of water. I paused at the door, listening to the silence, then stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of damp hay and old smoke. I climbed the ladder to the loft, the blue-ribboned key cool in my pocket. The door opened with a soft groan, the hinges swollen from the weather. Inside, the loft was dim, the light from the single window falling in a pale stripe across the floor. I knelt in the center of the room, the ledgers and photographs spread out around me, and began to sift through the boxes and trunks, searching for something I couldn't quite name. I found small things at first, a child's shoe, the leather cracked and soft, a button, still threaded with a bit of blue cloth, a locket, tarnished and cold in my palm. Each item felt like a fragment of a story, a piece of a life that had passed through this place and left something behind. I lined them up in the light, tracing their shapes with my fingers, trying to imagine the hands that had held them, the voices that had called out in the night. As I worked, the rain picked up again, drumming softly on the roof. I found myself thinking of the stranger, of his family, of the night the barn glowed with fire. I wondered what it meant to survive, to carry the weight of memory and loss. I wondered if the things we leave behind are ever enough to tell the whole story, or if they're just echoes, fading with each passing year. Near the back wall, beneath a loose floorboard, I found a small tin box. The lid was rusted, the edges sharp. Inside were a few more keepsakes, a faded ribbon, a scrap of paper with a child's handwriting, a locket tarnished and cold in my palm. Each item felt like a fragment of a story, a piece of a life that had passed through this place and left something behind. I lined them up in the light, tracing their shapes with my fingers, trying to imagine the hands that had held them, the voices that had called out in the night. I wondered if the past could ever really be washed away. On the third morning, the rain slowed to a mist. The world outside was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and something older, something like memory. I pulled on my boots and jacket, the ground sucking at my feet as I crossed the yard. The barn looked different in the gray light, its boards dark with rain, the roof shining with a thin sheen of water. I paused at the door, listening to the silence, then stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of damp hay and old smoke. I climbed the ladder to the loft, the blue-ribboned key cool in my pocket. The door opened with a soft groan, the hinges swollen from the weather. Inside, the loft was dim, the light from the single window falling in a pale stripe across the floor. I knelt in the center of the room, the ledgers and photographs spread out around me, and began to sift through the boxes and trunks, searching for something I couldn't quite name. I found small things at first, a child's shoe, the leather cracked and soft, a button, still threaded with a bit of blue cloth, a locket, tarnished and cold in my palm. Each item felt like a fragment of a story, a piece of a life that had passed through this place and left something behind. I lined them up in the light, tracing their shapes with my fingers, trying to imagine the hands that had held them, the voices that had called out in the night. As I worked, the rain picked up again, drumming softly on the roof. I found myself thinking of the stranger, of his family, of the night the barn glowed with fire. I wondered what it meant to survive, to carry the weight of memory and loss. I wondered if the things we leave behind are ever enough to tell the whole story, or if they're just echoes, fading with each passing year. Near the back wall, beneath a loose floorboard, I found a small tin box. The lid was rusted, the edges sharp. Inside were a few more keepsakes, a faded ribbon, a scrap of paper with a child's handwriting, a locket tarnished and cold in my palm. Each item felt like a fragment of a story, a piece of a life that had passed through this place and left something behind. I lined them up in the light, tracing their shapes with my fingers, trying to imagine the hands that had held them and the voices that had called out in the night. I wondered, what do I owe to the living and to the dead? After a while, I gathered the keepsakes and carried them down to the kitchen. I laid them out on the table beside the ledgers and photographs, the house filled with the soft sound of rain and the faint, lingering scent of ash. I made tea, the kettle whistling in the quiet, and sat with the memories, letting them settle around me like dust. I thought about the stranger's words, about the way he'd looked at the barn, about the hope and sorrow in his eyes. As evening fell, the rain finally stopped. The world outside was washed clean, the air cool and sweet. I stood on the porch, the keepsakes in my hands, and watched the last of the clouds drift away. The barn stood silent in the fading light, its secrets laid bare, its shadows softer now. I felt a kind of peace settle in my chest, a sense that the story was no longer just mine to carry. I wondered if the stranger would ever return, if he would find what he was looking for, or if the past would stay here, woven into the walls and the fields and the rain. I thought about forgiveness, about the way it can slip through your fingers like water, about the way it can settle, quiet and sure, like ash after a fire. The night came on gentle, the stars bright above the wet fields. I closed the door behind me, the house warm and full of memory. The barn stood in the darkness, its secrets no longer heavy but part of the land, part of the story that would go on, long after the rain and the ash had faded. I let myself rest, the weight of the past lighter now, the promise of morning just beyond the window. The next morning, the world was washed in gold. Sunlight spilled across the fields, turning the wet grass to silver and the barn's old boards to honey. I stood at the kitchen window, hands wrapped around a mug, watching the light creep across the yard. The keepsakes from the loft, ribbon, locket, faded photograph, sat on the table beside the ledger, each one a quiet reminder of the lives that had passed through this place. The house felt different, lighter somehow, as if the rain had carried away some of the heaviness that had settled here for so long. I finished my coffee and slipped the blue-ribboned key into my pocket. The barn waited at the edge of the field, its doors open to the morning. I walked out, the grass cool and damp beneath my boots, the air filled with the scent of earth and new beginnings. The barn's shadows stretched long behind me, but the light was warm on my back. I paused at the door, listening to the hush, then stepped inside. The air was sweet with the smell of hay and sunlight. Dust motes danced in the beams of light, swirling in slow circles. I climbed the ladder to the loft, the key heavy in my hand. The door stood open now, the lock hanging loose, the secrets inside no longer hidden. I stepped into the loft, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight, and looked around at the boxes and trunks, the ledgers and keepsakes, the memories that filled the space. I sat in the center of the room, the morning light spilling across the floor, and waited. I didn't know what I was waiting for, an answer, a sign, a sense of peace. I listened to the quiet, to the sound of the wind moving through the cracks in the walls, to the distant call of a bird in the fields. The barn felt alive, as if it was breathing with me, holding the stories of everyone who had ever sought shelter here. After a while, I heard footsteps on the ladder. Slow, careful, familiar. The stranger appeared in the doorway, his hands still wrapped in bandages, his eyes softer than before. He didn't speak at first, just stood in the light, looking around the loft as if seeing it for the first time. I nodded, a silent invitation, and he stepped inside, moving with the careful reverence of someone entering a church. We sat together in the quiet, the keepsakes spread out between us. He picked up the locket, turning it over in his hands, the metal catching the light. He opened it, revealing a tiny photograph inside, a woman's face, smiling, her eyes bright with hope. He closed it gently, setting it back on the floor. He touched the ribbon, the button, the faded photograph, each one a thread in the tapestry of his family story. I watched him, the silence between us filled with understanding. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in a handkerchief. He set it on the floor between us and unfolded it carefully. Inside was a letter, yellowed with age, and another photograph, this one of the barn, taken from the road, the fields wide and empty behind it. He slid the letter toward me, his hands trembling. "My mother wrote this," he said quietly. "She wanted someone to remember, to know that we were here." I took the letter, the paper soft and fragile in my hands. The words were written in a careful, looping script, the ink faded but still legible. She wrote of fear and hope, of the kindness of strangers, of the promise that had kept them safe for a little while. She wrote of gratitude and of sorrow, and of the wish that her children would one day return to this place and find peace. I read the letter aloud, my voice soft in the quiet, the words settling over us like a blessing. When we finished, we sat in silence, the weight of the past finally shared. The stranger closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a line down his cheek. He left the letter and the photograph on the floor. A piece of his family's history returned to the place where it began. I promised him I would remember, that I would keep the story alive, that the barn would always be a place of shelter and memory. We sat together until the light shifted, the sun climbing higher in the sky. The stranger stood, his movements slow and careful, and looked around the loft one last time. He nodded, a quiet farewell, and climbed down the ladder, his footsteps fading into the hush. I stayed in the loft, the letter and photograph in my lap, the morning light warm on my face. When I finally left the barn, the world felt new. The secrets that had weighed so heavy were now part of the story, woven into the walls, in the fields, and the sunlight. I walked back to the house, the blue ribboned key in my pocket, the promise of remembrance in my heart. The barn stood open to the day, its doors unlocked, its shadows softened by the light. I closed my eyes, the memory of the morning light lingering, and let myself hope that forgiveness, like sunlight, could find its way through even the oldest cracks.
The morning after the stranger left, I woke before the sun. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a held breath. I lay in bed for a while, listening to the soft tick of the clock, the distant call of a bird waking somewhere in the fields. The air was cool, and the light that crept through the curtains was gentle, almost golden. I sat up slowly, feeling the weight of the past days settle in my bones. But it was a different kind of weight now, lighter somehow, as if something had finally been set down. I moved through the house in silence, my footsteps soft on the old floorboards. The wooden box sat on the mantel, the letter and photograph and keepsakes inside, a quiet testament to the story that had finally been told. I paused in the kitchen, pouring a cup of coffee, and stood at the window, watching the first light spill across the fields. The barn stood at the edge of it all, its doors open to the morning, the shadows inside no longer so heavy. I stepped out onto the porch, the boards cool beneath my feet, and breathed in the scent of dew and earth. The world felt new, as if the rain and the telling had washed something clean. The grass sparkled in the sunlight, and the barn's old boards glowed warm and gold. I walked out across the yard, the air crisp and full of promise, and paused at the barn door. The silence was different now, softer, welcoming, as if the barn itself was breathing easier. Inside, the loft was filled with light. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams, swirling in slow, lazy circles. The boxes and trunks were still there, but the sense of burden was gone. I climbed the ladder, my hands steady on the rungs, and sat in the loft, letting the sunlight warm my face. I thought about the stranger, about his family, about the promise my grandfather had made and the cost of keeping it. I thought about the way stories can bind us, and the way forgiveness can settle in the quiet spaces between words. I stayed there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the morning, the distant hum of a tractor, the call of a crow, the gentle creak of the barn as it settled into the day. I felt the peace of it, the way the light filled every corner, the way the air seemed to hum with possibility. I realized then that the barn would never be just a building again. It was a keeper of stories, a witness to sorrow and hope, a place where secrets could rest and be remembered. When I finally climbed down, the sun was high and the world was awake. I walked back to the house, the grass soft beneath my boots, and stood for a moment on the porch, looking out at the fields. The land felt different, as if it too had been changed by the telling. I thought about the stranger, about the way he had left something behind and taken something with him. I hoped he had found a measure of peace, that the story he carried was lighter now. Inside, the house was filled with light. I opened the windows, letting the breeze move through the rooms, carrying away the last traces of smoke and sorrow. I set the wooden box on the table, a quiet promise to remember, to keep the story alive. I knew there would always be questions, always be things left unsaid, but the silence no longer felt so heavy. It was a space where new things could grow. As the day moved on, I found myself humming, a tune I didn't recognize, soft and low. I moved through the house, tending to small things, watering the plants, folding the laundry, sweeping the porch. Each task felt different, lighter, as if the house itself was grateful for the change. I thought about the barn, about the way the morning light had filled it, about the way forgiveness can come quietly, like sunlight through an open door. That evening, as the sun set and the sky turned soft and blue, I sat on the porch and watched the shadows stretch across the fields. The barn stood at the edge of the light, its doors open, its secrets at rest. I felt a quiet hope settle in my chest, a sense that the story was not just an ending, but a beginning. I closed my eyes, listening to the hush in the evening, and let myself believe that the land, the barn, and the people who had passed through would all be remembered. The world was quiet, the air cool and sweet. I sat there until the stars came out, one by one, the sky deep and endless above the fields. The barn was just a shadow now, but I knew it was filled with light. I stood, stretching, and turned back toward the house, the windows glowing warm behind me, and let the door close softly at my back, the memory of morning light lingering, and carried the peace of it with me into the quiet night.